This is an interview of Tom Little on the 22nd of September, 2008. Tom, tell me a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, I came from the Hudson Valley up in New York State, about 40 miles south of Albany, New York, on a farm in a little town called Kinderhook. And I grew up there, went to a small high school, and had kind of an idyllic childhood on the farm, riding horses and raising vegetables and other farm activities.
What year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from high school in 1967. And from there I went on to do university at Tufts University in Boston, and was there for 4 years.
And what kind of crops did your father raise on the farm?
Well, it was kind of a gentleman's farm. He was an eye surgeon, but he always really wanted to be a farmer. So we had this. We had a large family, 7 children, and the farm was mainly to keep us busy, I think, and also to grow things for us to eat as a family. So we grew lots of varied vegetables, and we had an orchard with lots of different kinds of trees that he picked out and planted himself. We had cows that we milked for our own use. We sold a bit of the milk. We had chickens and pigs and horses and bees and all kinds of whatever we thought would be fun to do.
And what kind of fruits in the orchard?
Well, he had about 10 different types of apples. He liked the older varieties, the Northern Spas and the Cortlands, so we had a lot of those. We also had different types of plums and some peaches, although peaches often didn't work in that climate. They often froze. We had hazelnuts and apricots, and we had a large blueberry patch also.
And how big a high school was it did you went to?
Well, it's a small high school. Our graduating class was always less than 100. It was about 80 in the graduating class.
I see. And what kind of things were you interested in high school?
Well, I was a fairly good student, but I also was interested in some sports. I was mostly track and field, so I did a lot of running when I was in high school. Yeah, and some soccer and basketball also.
And what did you major in college?
I was pre-med most of the, so I took a lot of science, but I majored in biology and chemistry, but I think I almost had a double major in anthropology at the same time. So I took a lot of other courses besides science.
And what, you 4 years in college?
Yeah, 4 years in college, and then right after college I went to seminary, actually, in Toronto. My wife and I, Libby, got married in my last year at college. Libby comes from the same home area in New York, so we had known each other for many years. So we were married and looking to go overseas, even at that point in university. So I went to 2 years to Toronto, to the University of Toronto, to Wycliffe College, to do some seminary studies.
And what after that seminary?
Well, during the second year there, my mother died unexpectedly. So after the second year, we moved back to the farm to help my father, just to be there. I worked with him a bit at his office, but also kind of took over the caring for the land there. So we were on the farm for about 2.5 years after that.
And what after that then?
Well, we got restless again and was thinking going overseas, and I went back to do some more study in Boston this time, north of Boston at Gordon Conwell Seminary. And I studied there for a year, and we went to, at the end of that, we went to a Wycliffe Translator Summer Institute of Linguistics in North Dakota, thinking we may go into Wycliffe Translators. But instead opted to do a short-term mission trip or job with a group called Dilaram Ministries, which was based in Holland. And this group worked with what used to be called hippies, Westerners that were traveling mostly to the east, to India and Sri Lanka and Nepal. And so we agreed to go to their training facility in Holland in 1976, December 1976, and we were there for 4 months in Holland. But at the end of that, in April 1977, we were asked by the leader of that group to go to Afghanistan to lead the Dilaram House, which is kind of a Christian community in Afghanistan. And that's where we went in 1977.
And so you arrived what month in 77?
In April 1977, I arrived first, and Lippy and our then one daughter, Molly, arrived a few weeks later.
I see. And where did you go in Afghanistan?
Well, we lived in Kabul, the capital. That's where the work was. So we mostly stayed there, although at that time we could travel around, and we did do some trips to the surrounding areas, but mostly based in Kabul.
And how did you make contact with the hippies that were there?
Well, at any one time in Kabul, there were approximately 10,000 of these young people going one way or the other, or just stuck there for various reasons. And there were lots of what we used to call hippie hotels, cheap hotels that catered to these travelers, and they were all over the place. You didn't have any trouble finding them. So we would often just go to the hotels and sit around and talk to the folks, and we'd bring them clean water and medical. We'd advise them on medical care where they could get it, or some of the folks that got sick, usually with amoebic dysentery or typhoid even, we'd take them back out to our house, and we had kind of an infirmary there. But we'd often have groups come out in the evening for dinner, and we'd play badminton or volleyball or croquet and have discussions and prayer and a good time, a good meal, and we'd take them back into town.
How did the hippies end up going to Afghanistan? What attracted them to Afghanistan?
Well, they weren't particularly going to Afghanistan, although some, that was one draw. Most of them were headed, if they're from Europe anyway, they were headed to India, to the various, either for religious purposes, to an ashram, or some other Hindu or Buddhist place, or just for the adventure of it, or for drugs, just lots of, or just for adventure. But 99% of these people had to pass through Afghanistan. Very few went through Baluchistan in Pakistan. That was a much more difficult and less interesting route. So they came overland through Turkey and Iran and then into the western part of Afghanistan. So there were numerous buses bringing these people, or they'd come in their own cars or whatever, and they had to all come through Kabul. So they all wanted to stay a few days at least there, but a lot of them, or some of them anyway, got sick, or they lost their passports, or they got into trouble with drugs because drugs are so cheap to obtain in Afghanistan. So there was a number of people that were in distress there.
Did you see any changes in any lives there while you were working with them?
Well, in our Dilaram house, we had a number of them that became Christians and were baptized. Some of them stayed there for a while. Some of them moved on and came back. But there were quite a large number of these folks that gave their lives to Jesus and had their lives changed radically, really, from what they were.
And how long were you in that ministry?
Well, we came in April 1977, and we went home for a couple months during that first year to have our second child, but came back. And in April 1978, there was a coup in Afghanistan in which a communist government overthrew the President Daoud. And so that kind of disrupted the whole traveler business because we couldn't get tourist visas anymore. So it basically stopped these young people from coming through Afghanistan. And it also prevented us from getting visas. We ourselves had to leave the country after a few months.
Where were you living in Afghanistan at the time of the coup?
We were in Kabul in the Dilaram house. It was a very noisy night, and in late April 1978, and we were there for a few weeks after that also.
You had mentioned something about a friend, Afghan, who basically saved the lives of your family. Was that in Kabul or was that later in Herat?
That was later in Herat. We after the coup, we had to, as I said, we couldn't get tourist visas, which is what we were on. So we had to go to Pakistan, to Peshawar, and we felt God was leading us to eventually come back to Afghanistan. So we were applying for permanent visas to work in the newer eye program, the eye care program. And after a few months, in July 1978, we did get these visas and came back. And after some language study for a few months, we were sent to Herat on the western border with Iran to help finish the construction of an eye hospital that had begun there. And it's while there in March of 1979, after being in Herat for about 4 months, there was an uprising there in Herat where the population, the local population and the surrounding villagers rose up against, mainly against the Russian advisors and their communist, Afghan communist counterparts in Herat. And there was a major disruption there. For 2 weeks we were kind of underground, so to speak. But there was this one family that was on our street that we hardly knew. When the mobs were coming through the city looking for Russians to literally kill, and we were quite vulnerable, of course, because we kind of looked like Russians compared to Afghans anyway. This old man from this family slept out in front of our front door all night and waved the crowds by, saying that no, these aren't Russians living here, they're Christians and they're here to help us. So I only found out about this next morning when I peeked out the front door and found him sleeping in front of our steps.
Well, but he didn't know you that well, is that right?
He knew us a little bit, not very well, no.
Wow. Did you get to know him later?
Yes, we did actually. We got to know him, and his wife used to. His wife used to come over and help Libby take care of, especially of our youngest daughter, while Libby was teaching Molly and some of the neighborhood kids in a little school we had there. We would call her Modari Nasim, the mother of Nasim, Nasim was their oldest son. She would come and help care for our daughter Nelika. And we in fact have visited this son, Nassim. He lives now in Indianapolis, Indiana, with his family.
Wow, that's interesting. So you got through that tough time. How did you happen to get involved in the eye work?
Well, because my father was an eye doctor, an eye surgeon, for the fun of it, I used to go and work at his office during high school, on vacations and on weekends. And I would work mainly as an optician, but I'd also work with the patients a little bit in triage. And after when we came back after I did some seminary work in Toronto, he taught me how to check the eyes for glasses, and I did that too. So I had some background in working with eyes, nothing formal. And somehow the folks in Kabul heard about this. The folks that worked at an eye hospital there was a mission called the International Assistance Mission that had a place called the Noor Eye Institute in Kabul, a very nice eye hospital. So somehow they heard that I was an optician, and literally the first day that I got off the plane, I was at the hospital helping there. So it worked out well, because most of these hippies, these travelers that we were ministering to, didn't get up until after 12 in the noontime. So until 12, I often went out to the hospital and worked there as a volunteer.
And your background gave you good background for that, is that right? Yeah,
I was able to contribute there in areas that I knew about, and I also learned some new things.
And you set up their center in Herat then?
Well, not just us. There was a team of us there that finally got the hospital finished in spite of major difficulties there in security situation, political situation. And we finally got it going in the summer of 1979. And it was running well there. We were busy, and we were there until the winter of 1979 and 80. That's when, during Christmas, just after Christmas 1979, the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and we were among the first ones to see them coming down from Russia into Herat, because the border with Russia was only a few miles away from Herat.
Was Herat quite different than Kabul?
It was much more traditional. An old world city, still had a covered bazaar. It had a lot of the characteristics of one of these old cities that Marco Polo would have recognized, or other old travelers. It hadn't changed that much. There were very few cars at that time. The main mode of transportation was horse-drawn carriages, a particular type that they use there, or bicycle. But it was a quaint little city at that point.
Did you find that the Afghans had a lot of eye problems?
Well, they do have a lot of eye problems, but the main difficulty that they had was there was no real care available to them when they did get problems. But they had specific problems. In Herat, there was a major center for a disease called trachoma, which affects the eyelids, and it's prevalent in some parts of the world still. It's a major blinding disease, and it was a major disease in Herat, along with all other types that are more common.
What caused that?
It's caused by a chlamydial microbe that is spread mostly by flies that pick up this microbe in latrines, literally. So it's a disease caused by poor sanitation and poor fly control. Oh. It was in the Middle East and in Central Asia, and even in America in colonial times, it was a major blinding disease. But as sanitation conditions improved, this disease was eradicated from most of the world. Many of the main eye hospitals, the old eye hospitals in North America and Europe, were set up to treat mostly soldiers coming back, in Europe anyway, soldiers coming back from their wars in the Middle East or India, and who had contracted trachoma.
And how is it normally treated?
Well, you can treat it temporarily with an antibiotic. Tetracycline will kill the chlamydial microbe, but that's not a cure. The main cure is to clean up the sanitation conditions. That's the main way to control the disease.
And how long did you live in Herat?
We lived there approximately a year and a half.
And why did you move from there?
Well, we had planned to move. After we had set it up, we were going to go back to the States anyway. So we had another fellow that was coming out to replace me. The hospital's running, and I trained the people I needed to train, and we had a plan to go back to America. So we left in January 1980 to go back. And we were to leave Afghanistan from Kabul. But while we were having our farewell ceremony in Kabul, or just before the ceremony, the head of our organization, the International Assistance Mission, talked to us, Libby and I, privately, and asked us to stay on and be the administrator for the Newer Eye Institute, because the fellow that was doing that from Sweden, her father was very sick and he had to leave quickly. So even though we continued on with our farewell ceremony, at the end of it we said we were staying anyway. But it was nice to hear all the nice things people said about us at the farewell. It's like going to your own funeral.
That's great. Libby said something about what you had to evacuate out of Herat to go to Kabul one time, and the UN was taking a convoy, but you didn't. Can you tell us about that?
Well, during this uprising in 1979, where the old guy slept in front of our porch, there were some other foreigners with the UN, with UN-related projects there, or World Bank projects also. And they had organized a convoy to go out. We were a bit suspicious of this convoy anyway, but we felt that we should stay. That was our, at that point, we felt we should stay. We didn't really want to go with this convoy, and we didn't. And we learned later that the convoy did have lots of problems. So we stayed on, but at the end, we had to there was a plan for Libby's mother to fly to Afghanistan, and we had no communication since this uprising began 2 weeks prior. We had no communication with the outside world. There was no cell phones in, or satellite phones, or any way to communicate. So it was kind of a blackout, and we didn't know if she was coming or not. In fact, she had been advised by the State Department in Washington not to go, and was even told that her family there was probably dead in Herat. But she, through persistence, went anyway, and so we, not knowing whether she was coming or not, we set out overland ourselves to go to Kabul. So we drove a vehicle, we borrowed a vehicle, and attempted to drive out of the city back to Kabul, the 800-mile trip back to Kabul.
And was that through the mountains?
Well, it doesn't go through the center mountains in the country. The main road from Herat to Kabul goes south of the mountains. It goes south and then north, south to Kandahar, and then back up northeast to Kabul. But it goes over some smaller mountains near Herat, and then another range before you get into Kabul.
And were there any interesting experiences on that during that trip?
Well, yeah, it was we were driving an old VW van, if any of you older folks remember what they were like. And it wasn't in very good shape to begin with. So soon after leaving Herat and into the mountains, we had our first flat tire, and the tire didn't just go flat, it disintegrated. It just fell apart on the road, and we said, well, we have a spare tire. But when I looked at the spare tire, it was completely bald, and it didn't look very good. And we had 400 miles to go through the desert of death, literally. That's a desert called the Desert of Death, to Kandahar. And so we put that on, and but soon after that, after putting on the spare tire, we were stopped by a roadblock of these mujahideen, some of the folks from these groups that had come into Kabul, into Herat to kill the Russians, and they were manning roadblocks on the roads leaving Herat, and they stopped us, and they thought we were Russians, and they meant to do harm to us. There was no doubt about that. But we communicated to them that we were working at the Noor Eye Hospital in Herat, and when I said that, the one fellow holding the gun on Libby, on the passenger side, actually dropped his gun on Libby's lap and put his finger on his eye and said his eye hurt. Chesham Dadad Mekana, he said in Persian, and we fortunately had some eye medicine, and we treated him, and we were the honored guests of that roadblock crew, treated very nicely, and sent on our way.
That's great.
And we finally made it to Kandahar. Even while crossing the Desert of Death, 2 of the 4 cylinders in this air-cooled Volkswagen engine stopped working, and we kind of came into Kandahar very slowly and with lots of smoke coming out the exhaust, but we made it to that point. And there we were able to call Kabul and find out that, in fact, Libby's mother had arrived the day before.
And then you stayed in Kabul for a while?
Well, we had to get to Kabul first. We had to fix up the car and try to get it fixed up enough to get over the main mountains near Ghazni into Kabul, and we barely made it over the mountain, and then from there we could coast into Kabul, the 100-mile, literally we could coast for 100 miles into Kabul. And we stayed in Kabul for a month with Libby's mother, and then flew back to Herat in the month of May.
What did you do with the car?
Well, we left it there. Yeah.
That's great. Well, then you stayed in Afghanistan after that, right?
We went back to Herat and stayed in Herat until, as I said, the middle of January 1980, when we had our farewell party, but afterwards we stayed on anyway, and we stayed until the summer of 1980, and then we went back to the States for a home leave. We went back to our home area in New York State for 3 months, and then returned to Afghanistan after that.
And did you have 3 girls at that time? Or?
No, we just had 2 girls then.
2 girls then.
So we went back to Kabul, and we were there for 6 months. A little less than 6 months actually, just 4 months. And there, at that point, there was 2 of our co-workers, the pharmacist at the eye hospital and his wife, were murdered under suspicious circumstances. Of course, the government was, the Russians were there. It was a kind of a restrictive government. We were all a bit fearful of how this new government would treat foreigners. So there were lots of rumors floating around of who did this murder. So eventually, after a few weeks, the whole team, the foreign team, which was about 60 people at that point, 50 people with dependents and everything, we evacuated Kabul, Afghanistan. Kabul was the only city we were working in as an organization at that point. So we evacuated. We came back to the States ourselves. We came in 1981. Libby and the children settled into the States. I went to continue working with CBM for a few more months. They wanted someone to fill in for a position in Ghana, in Africa, West Africa. So I went back to Ghana for a few months and then returned to back to the States. And we stayed in the States.
Where did Libby and the children settle at that time?
Well, they were staying with Libby's mother for a little bit, and then they found an apartment or rented a house in our hometown of Kinderhook.
What was that? Kinderhook is in what, New York?
New York State, yeah, south of Albany.
Great.
And they were there when I came back, and then we found another house up near Albany because I got a job working with Afghan refugees that had been recently resettled in America, in the Albany area. So I worked there and also worked with my father a little bit still. But we lived in the Albany area, in a little town called Delmar, south of Albany. We lived there for approximately 2 years, a little over 2 years, and working with Afghans mainly.
I see. And so, how then you went back again to Afghanistan?
Yeah, in 1984 we returned to Afghanistan to work in the eye hospital, and we were there until almost 1989, when we took another break and came back to the States for a year and a half. Our oldest daughter was in Woodstock School in India, and she was not happy there, so we came back to the States and again lived in this town of Delmar at another location. But in 1990 we returned to Kabul again.
What was it like when the Russians were there?
Well, we were restricted, as I said, to living in Kabul. We couldn't go outside of the main city. But in Kabul, life was fairly normal. I mean, there was lots of Russian soldiers and advisors around, but the infrastructure was well taken care of. There was electricity, and the Afghans were employed. There were lots of factories still functioning. We were watched all the time by KGB or the Afghan equivalent, what that's called HUD, the Afghan Secret Police. There were occasional rockets that were fired in from the surrounding areas. We could hear fighting in the surrounding surrounding areas outside of the city. There were occasional car bombs that went off in the city, but by and large it was pretty fairly routine life and comfortable life actually in Kabul at that point.
And when did the Russians leave?
They left in 1988.
And what happened?
They left a government that they supported, and life continued to be quite comfortable actually in Kabul. After the Russians left, we were able to venture a bit outside of the city into the areas north of the city to do eye clinics. In these areas were Mujahideen groups that were hoping to take over from the communists, but this situation lasted until 1992, actually, when these Mujahideen groups actually did come into the city, and the remnants of the communist government had to flee or were killed. And that's when life really changed in Kabul, particularly after 1992. The various groups that came into Kabul at first cooperated a bit, but very soon they were fighting each other for control of various parts of the capital, or to be influential in various aspects in the government. So progressively they literally destroyed the city by in their feuds with each other.
And did the Taliban actually take over, or what happened there?
Well, this feuding went on from 1992 until 1996. Just before 1996, there was kind of a agreement between the two main factions, and Kabul did become peaceful for a few months before 96. But the Taliban at that point were just outside of the city, and they began lobbing shells into the city. And in April 1996, they actually entered the city. And during one night, we woke up and the Taliban were in control that morning.
You had mentioned that your house actually got hit by a shell. When was that?
Well, that was during this feuding period when the different Mujahideen groups were fighting each other. It was an anti-tank round that hit our house. It actually didn't explode. It became embedded in the wall of our daughter's bedroom. So when we were actually not there at the time, we were on a short home leave back to the States. But when we came back, we asked people about what to do about this, and they said just don't put up pictures in that part of the wall, don't hammer on that part of the wall, and literally we just plastered up the wall and fixed the window and continued as if nothing had ever happened there. But we told our daughter not to pound on that part of the wall with a hammer or anything.
What was that, 96 or what?
That was 1994, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
How much longer did you live in that?
2 more years.
2 more years. And where did you move from there?
We were in that house after the Taliban came for about a year, 3 years after the Taliban came. And our neighbors on one side he was Afghan, but he had lived in the Middle East for a long time. He was he was an official in Al-Qaeda actually, and we got into some disputes with this fellow. It got kind of, yeah, it's a long story. Anyway, we were forced to leave that house because of these disputes, and we had to move to a different location down the street. So we moved at that point.
What, did he want more money, or?
Well, actually, there was a handicapped child, not his own, but one that lived on the street. And one time I came back, Libby was working, I was the only one in the house, and I stopped the car, a Land Cruiser car, and went into the house to get something and bring it out. And they had placed this handicapped child under the passenger front wheel tire of my vehicle. So when I started up, I actually ran over the child. And they claimed it was his own child, and that I had run over his child. And so they wanted me to pay $50,000, and they tried to put me in jail. Fortunately, I had friends, and many of them were our patients, who were high-ranking Taliban, who intervened to prevent them from putting me in jail to force this payment. And a dispute ensued. We did end up paying something, more of a traditional amount. So it got kind of ugly, and and we didn't feel safe living there.
So you
after
moved
that.
to another area of
Well, it
Kabul?
wasn't that far away. It was just down the road, actually,
Yeah.
but away from that house. And we moved to the other side of town for a number of months until we found another place.
Yeah.
But then moved back to the.
Now, it seemed that somebody told me that you, during that time of all the fighting with the Taliban, etc., that a lot of the Westerners left, but you stayed there. When was that?
Well, it was before the Taliban came. Of course, during the time when there was heavy fighting in Kabul, it literally was not a safe place to be. There were lots of random rocket and missile shells landing all the time, sometimes much worse than others. There were major battles that occurred between the two groups on this front line that was just a few miles, less than a mile actually, from our house. And there were many incentives to leave, but we never felt we should leave. We had Afghan neighbors and they couldn't leave. We were also volunteering at a Red Cross hospital. There were some foreign and Afghan Red Cross personnel that ran a very vital hospital there. We used to volunteer, and we also continued our eye hospital work at other locations around the city. That helped. We weren't doing regular cataracts and typical eye surgery. It was all trauma surgery and trauma care at that point, working with the Red Cross mostly, but also in our own hospitals. So we felt that we really shouldn't be leaving at this point, so we did stay, along with some others.
I guess the Afghans appreciated that?
I think they did. On both sides of the line, we had lots of friends, and they helped us when they could, and we were never targeted. Even sometimes when we were crossing the front lines from one side to the other, excuse me, we occasionally happened to cross when they were fighting each other, and they would at one time anyway, they literally stopped fighting when they saw our car coming, which was one of the few cars that was operating freely. We had a flag on the roof, and it was recognized because we acted kind of as an ambulance. When there were missile strikes on civilian homes, we would often go and take the wounded to the Red Cross hospital. So we were well known, and they at one time at least, they actually stopped fighting each other and let us pass. Somehow they communicated with each other, and after we passed, they started fighting again.
What kind of a flag was it?
We had a flag that had the words "I am," which is the initials for the International Assistance Mission, but for those who are Christians, it has a meaning also.
Yeah, that's great. Switching back to the couple that were murdered, you had mentioned something about it ended up having to do with money, is that right?
Well, it's still a bit uncertain what happened, but it may have been a robbery. It probably was a robbery. Yeah, that's probably the most likely scenario.
And that was sad because they left, the couple was murdered, but their children were...
Yeah, they drugged the children with a chloroform, and when the children woke up a few hours later, they found their parents dead. The children were 5 years old and 3 years old, about the same age as our kids at the time.
And what nationality were they?
They were Finnish.
Finnish.
Well, the wife was Finnish and the husband was Dutch.
And the children were then sent back?
They were sent back to Finland to live with the wife's sister's family.
It's very sad, very
Yes.
sad.
Just recently, just in the last few years, the boy, who was the same age as our daughter Molly, came to Kabul, came back for the first time, and he stated that one of the best times for him was actually talking with Molly. about their experience and reliving it through their young eyes.
Wow, that is something. Well, then the Taliban were there till what, 2001?
Yeah, the Taliban stayed on until September 2001. We were, as a group, expelled in August 2001 for a number of reasons. And the Taliban confiscated all of our homes and the belongings and our offices and cars and everything. And so, of course, shortly after that, shortly after they were expelled, 9/11 occurred. And then shortly after that, in early October, the American-led takeover of Afghanistan occurred. And I went back with a few others of the leadership of the IM just after this retaking of Kabul, and we went back for a week or so to see about the situation there.
And so the new government took over in Kabul?
Yeah, it took over then, an interim government.
And what were they like to deal with?
Well, there was a number of different governments that came. It kind of evolved into what it is now. They had an interim administration at first, and things were kind of confused, of course. But we didn't return to Afghanistan until the next year as a family. When we came back, they were just starting. They were just beginning to have the. They were looking forward to the elections of the president and the parliament in 2003, I think, 2 and 3. And so while we were there in those first few years after 9/11, this new government took shape. And there were some good things about it and some difficult aspects. There was a lot of money involved, a lot of aid being given to Afghanistan. And when there's a lot of money, of course, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of criminal activity, a lot of pressure for bribery to take place. So some things got better and some things didn't. But we were still able to work there.
Was it pretty bureaucratic?
Well, it always becomes, when you get that kind of, when you get a situation where there's so much money coming in, there's a lot of bureaucrats also up here, and the bureaucracy does get a little more cumbersome. But you know, we're able to work there okay.
Now, you developed quite a pretty good capability in Persian, right? Speaking Persian?
I speak Persian. Some of our group are a little better in Pashto, the other language. Depends what part of the country they work in.
Where did you pick up your language skills?
Well, when we first went with IM, as I said, we had some language courses, and it's mostly on the job, just speaking it and studying it on our own. The Persian spoken in Afghanistan is different, sounds different, and there are different words involved than the Persian spoken in Iran. So it's best to learn Persian in the country you want to work in.
What percentage of the people speak Persian there?
Approximately half the population. But a lot of the people that aren't Persian speakers, the Pashto speakers, also know Persian as a second language. So there's a lot of the population that are bilingual.
Mm-hmm. And the Noor clinics now, are they quite advanced compared to what they were originally?
Well, they are in some ways. We try to keep them appropriately simple so that they can be self-sustaining someday, and not too fancy. But we do have some more sophisticated equipment now. We try to train the doctors to a little higher level.
And mainly Afghan doctors and supporters?
Yeah, we train Afghans. There's a few foreigners like myself, eye doctors and optometrists and opticians and pharmacists and technical people. But our main job is to train Afghans, and they're the ones doing most of the work in the various projects.
Now, when I was visiting you, it sounded like you ordered and got a lot of your supplies from Pakistan, India, China, etc. Is that right?
Yeah, it's logistically it's easier and it's a lot less expensive than trying to get supplies from Europe. We make as much as we can in the country. For instance, we make most of our eye drops, about 400,000 bottles of eye drops. But the raw materials for these eye drops, for instance, have to be brought in the bottles also. But so we have to import instruments and raw materials from mostly India and China, some from Pakistan.
And do you have it shipped in, or do you send somebody to pick it up?
It's shipped in by air freight usually. We've tried to get some containers in from India, but that's not been very successful. Sometimes we have to go out and get things ourselves if it's urgent, but we can air freight items in.
And where do you buy the glasses?
Well, India and Nepal, India and China. And some of the Chinese goods are easily purchased in Pakistan, so we would buy a lot of the Chinese goods there. But in the future, we would like to go directly to China and buy some of the goods there.
And what are your plans for the future now?
Well, Libby and I have been in the States here for a little over 2 years while I've been doing some extra studies. So in 2 weeks we return to Afghanistan after a short time in England and India. So hopefully in a month or so we should be back in Kabul, and we plan to work there long term, as long as we're able to anyway.
Is the NOR work growing there, or?
Well, it's changing. We're not trying to be as big as possible. We try to. The idea is to start projects and get them going and try to get them self-sustaining, and then spin them off on their own, and then at the same time starting new projects in different parts of the country. So we're trying to become, in one way, smaller, but in another way, bigger and more complicated in the fact of going into new areas around the country. So it's kind of changing, and it's the way it looks and acts.
What's the most challenging areas that you're doing work in?
Well, in one way, the most challenging areas are the areas where the war is now. There's an active war going on in about half the country. And to try to get eye care to those areas is very difficult. We have recently opened an eye hospital in Kandahar, which is a difficult city at the moment. With the help of a local Afghan businessman, we've been able to do this. He's supplied the building free of charge and pulled strings so that we can stay there. We've trained Afghan personnel to work there. So working in these areas is difficult, and it's difficult. Another challenge is to train Afghan doctors and other eye care professionals from rural areas outside of the capital or the big cities, and with the intention of them going back to those areas. It's always a temptation, of course, for people you train to stay in the big cities to make more money. But our intention is to try to get eye care to the areas that do not have these facilities. So that's our main challenge, to get people out to their rural areas.
Now, I thought that Afghanistan did not have resources, but you mentioned it does have some resources.
Well, I'm no expert at this, but there have been geological surveys by mining experts from around the world that have indicated over the last 30 years really that there are major deposits of copper and iron and natural gas, and some oil, not huge reserves, and other
You had mentioned uranium.
uranium. There's supposed to be uranium also.
Yeah.
That is there. It's just never been developed. So there, especially right even near Kabul, there seems to be a huge deposit of copper, which I read in a news article that the Afghan government had signed some kind of agreement with the Chinese government to develop, but I'm not sure on the specifics. But there are natural resources there that could be developed.
Yeah. Are there no railroads in Afghanistan?
No, they're mainly because neither the British nor the Russians in the 19th century ever really controlled Afghanistan. They both wanted to, but they never were able to. The railroads from both sides stopped at the border. There's a short railroad in the north coming from the Russian, now the Independent Republic of Uzbekistan. There's a short railroad coming into Kabul, into Afghanistan, but it's just to the freight depot on the Afghan side. But there has been talk of railroads being built. But until the security situation improves, no one's really anxious to make that kind of investment.
Right, yeah. Tell me about what are your daughters doing now?
Well, our oldest daughter, Molly, she works with the United Nations in Jerusalem and the West Bank. She probably will be working also with the UN a bit in Baghdad, kind of working in both places, back and forth. Our middle daughter, Nelika, is in Kabul at the moment. She works for an Afghan news agency there. We're not sure how long she'll be there. And our youngest daughter, she just finished medical school in Buffalo, New York, and began a residency program in Texas.
Wow, so they all did well. And their schooling was mainly where?
Up until grade 8 or 9, it was mostly in homeschool or in the school that we had as a group in Afghanistan. And their high school years were mostly spent at a school called Woodstock School in northern India.
And but you say one of the daughters didn't particularly like that school, is that
Well,
right?
she didn't. At first, she was there. She went there for 8th grade, and she was a bit young. I think she got homesick. But after we got home and settled, she actually confessed that it wasn't so bad there, and she would like to go back. So that was one of the factors in deciding that we could go back.
I see.
And she finished her high school there.
Well, what do you know? That's great. Well, that's very interesting. We just wish you very well in the upcoming years, sir. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.